I'm Edwina, 67 years old, and after 3 decades of caring for my paralyzed husband, Thomas, I never expected to hear those words coming from his mouth. She's just a free servant. The moment those syllables reached my ears, something inside me shattered. 30 years of devotion reduced to servitude. That day, with trembling hands but resolute heart, I placed his diaper in his palm and finally spoke my truth. If you're watching this, please let me know where you're viewing from. Hit that like button and subscribe to join me on this journey of rediscovery. Thomas and I met 42 years ago at a friend's barbecue in Portland. I was 32, then working as a registered nurse at Providence Medical Center, while he was 35, a rising star in structural engineering. The first thing I noticed about Thomas was his confident stride and infectious laugh. He commanded attention without demanding it, a quality I found irresistible. "You must be Edwina," he said, handing me a glass of lemonade. "I've heard you're the best trauma nurse in the hospital." I blushed, surprised that he knew anything about me. "And you must be Thomas, the man who's supposedly redesigning half the skyline." Our connection was immediate and powerful. Thomas called me the very next day, and by the end of the week, we had our first official date at an upscale Italian restaurant downtown. He arrived with a bouquet of sunflowers, having somehow discovered they were my favorite. "I want to know everything about you," he said that night, his eyes never leaving mine. "Every dream, every fear, everything that makes you who you are." Our courtship was a whirlwind of romantic gestures and deep conversations. Thomas took me sailing on the Columbia River, dancing under the stars, and on impromptu road trips to the coast. He was attentive, passionate, and made me feel like the most important person in his world. 6 months later, Thomas proposed on the observation deck of the Space Needle during a weekend trip to Seattle. He had arranged for a violinist to play as he got down on one knee, producing a diamond ring that caught the setting sun perfectly. "Edwina McCarthy, you've brought light into my life I never knew was missing. Will you make me the happiest man alive and marry me?" Tears streaming down my face, I said yes without hesitation. We were married 8 months later in a beautiful ceremony at his family's church, followed by a reception at the Waverly Country Club. Our honeymoon in Hawaii was 2 weeks of pure bliss, swimming with sea turtles, watching sunsets from our private balcony, and making plans for our future together. The early years of our marriage were everything I had dreamed of. Thomas's career soared as he became a partner at his firm, while I continued working at the hospital, though I had reduced my hours to 3 days a week. We purchased a beautiful Tudor-style home in Lake Oswego with a garden I lovingly tended and a view of the water that took my breath away every morning. 2 years into our marriage, we welcomed our daughter, Jessica. Thomas was a doting father from the start, rushing home from work to rock her to sleep singing old Frank Sinatra songs in his deep baritone. When Michael was born 2 years later, our family felt complete. Thomas built the children a treehouse in the backyard, taught them to ride bikes, and coached Michael's little league team. From the outside, we were the perfect American family. But even in those golden years, there were shadows. Thomas's family, particularly his younger brother Frank, never quite accepted me. His mother would make subtle comments about my modest upbringing, while his father questioned my decision to continue working after having children. "A mother's place is with her children, not tending to strangers," he once remarked during Sunday dinner. Frank was the worst of them. 5 years younger than Thomas, he had always lived in his brother's shadow and seemed to resent me for taking up too much of Thomas's attention. "My brother could have had anyone," he once told me at a family gathering, his voice low and slightly slurred from too many drinks. "Models, heiresses, they were all after him. He settled for a nurse. Interesting choice." Thomas defended me when these comments happened in his presence, but he never truly confronted his family about their behavior. "They're just old-fashioned," he'd say. "They'll come around eventually." They never did. As Thomas's career advanced, he began spending more time at work. 60-hour weeks became the norm, and he frequently traveled for projects across the country. When home, he was often distracted, his mind still at the office, even as he sat at our dinner table. "I'm building something important," he would explain when I expressed concern. "I'm doing this for us, for our future." I believed him because I wanted to, but looking back, I can see the warning signs, the way he would dismiss my accomplishments at the hospital, how he started making financial decisions without consulting me, the growing impatience when the children interrupted his rare moments of relaxation at home. Thomas wasn't cruel or abusive. He was simply becoming increasingly self-centered. His career, his needs, his desires took precedence over everything else. I made excuses for him, rearranged my life to accommodate his, and convinced myself that this was what marriage was supposed to be: compromise and sacrifice. But the balance of sacrifice was already tipping heavily in one direction, even before the accident that would change everything. June 15th, 1993. The date is etched into my memory like a scar. It was a Tuesday, unusually hot for early summer in Oregon. I was tending to my garden when the phone rang. It was 2:15 in the afternoon, Mrs. Williams. An unfamiliar voice, clinical, but with an undercurrent of urgency. "This is Portland Memorial Hospital. Your husband has been in an accident at his construction site. You should come right away." The world tilted beneath my feet. "How bad is it?" I managed to ask. "The doctor will discuss his condition when you arrive," was all they would say. I called our neighbor to watch the children. Jessica was 11, Michael just 9, and drove to the hospital in a state of numb disbelief. As a nurse, I knew what it meant when they wouldn't give details over the phone. It meant prepare yourself. The emergency department was a familiar place to me, but walking through those sliding doors as a family member rather than a staff member was disorienting. A colleague recognized me, and her face crumpled with sympathy, another bad sign. "Edwina," Dr. Harrington greeted me in a private consultation room. I had worked with him for years. "Thomas fell from the third floor of the building site. He suffered a severe spinal cord injury at the C4, C5 level." The medical terminology didn't cushion the blow. C4, C5 meant quadriplegia. It meant paralysis from the neck down. "He's stabilized now, but I want to be very clear about what you're facing," Dr. Harrington continued. "Thomas will likely never regain function below his injury. He'll need ventilator support initially, though he may be able to breathe independently with time. He'll require 24-hour care for the rest of his life." "Can I see him?" was all I could ask. Thomas lay surrounded by machines, tubes emerging from his throat, his neck immobilized in a brace. His eyes, when they fluttered open, were wild with fear and confusion. "I'm here," I whispered, taking his hand, knowing he couldn't feel my touch. "I'm here, and we'll get through this." The months that followed were a blur of hospitals, rehabilitation facilities, medical consultations, and crash courses in spinal cord injury care. Thomas underwent 3 surgeries to stabilize his spine. He contracted pneumonia twice. He spent 6 weeks in intensive care before being transferred to a specialized rehabilitation center. Throughout it all, his emotional state deteriorated alongside his body. The proud, confident man I had married became a stranger consumed by rage and despair. "I would rather be dead than live like this," he told me repeatedly during those early days. "This isn't living." I would sit by his bedside holding his hand that couldn't hold back, promising him that we would adapt, that his life still had value and purpose. But privately, I was terrified. How would we manage? How would I care for him and our children? How would we afford the astronomical medical bills, the equipment, the home modifications? Thomas's anger eventually gave way to a deep depression. He refused to participate in therapy sessions, snapped at the rehabilitation specialists, and turned away when the children came to visit, unable to bear their tears and awkward attempts to connect with their changed father. "Daddy, I made you a card," Jessica said on one visit, holding up her artwork. "Put it on the table," Thomas replied flatly. "I can't hold it anyway." I watched my daughter's face crumple and felt something crack inside me, but I pushed the pain aside. There wasn't time for my feelings not with insurance forms to complete a home to modify, and children who needed reassurance that their world hadn't completely fallen apart. After 4 months in rehabilitation, Thomas came home to a house transformed. Our bedroom had been moved to the first floor. A hospital bed replaced our queen-sized mattress. The bathroom had been retrofitted with a roll-in shower and specialized equipment. Our savings were depleted, and though Thomas's firm had good insurance, it covered only a fraction of what we needed. The dynamic of our marriage shifted overnight from partnership to caretaker and dependent. I took a leave of absence from the hospital thinking it would be temporary. It wasn't. As the weeks stretched into months, it became clear that returning to work would be impossible. Thomas needed me constantly, and the cost of professional care would have exceeded my salary anyway. Our children tried to adjust to the new reality. Jessica took on additional household responsibilities without complaint. Michael became quieter, retreating into books and solitary activities. Both avoided bringing friends home, ashamed of the medical equipment, the sounds and smells that now permeated our house, and their father's unpredictable moods. Thomas's family's response was equally telling. His parents visited exactly twice before deciding that seeing their son in such a state was too distressing. They sent checks instead of support. Frank came more frequently, but his visits inevitably left Thomas agitated and me exhausted from mediating their tense interactions. "You're letting her coddle you," I overheard Frank tell Thomas 6 months after the accident. "You need to be tougher, demand more from these doctors. There are experimental treatments overseas." When I explained that we had already consulted with the top specialists in the country, Frank dismissed me with a wave. "What would a nurse know about cutting-edge medicine? You're thinking too small like always." As that first year drew to a close, I realized that the accident hadn't just broken Thomas's body, it had fundamentally altered who he was, or perhaps revealed aspects of his character that had always been there, now amplified by trauma and dependency. And it had changed me too, transforming me from wife to caregiver, from partner to provider, from individual to appendage. But I was determined to honor the vows I had made, for better or for worse, in sickness and in health. I just never imagined how much of both our lives would be consumed by the worse and the sickness, or how little room would be left for anything else. My day began at 5 a.m. every morning without fail. The alarm would buzz softly beside me on the cot I had set up next to Thomas's hospital bed. I learned to wake instantly, silencing it before it could disturb him, though in truth, Thomas was often already awake, staring at the ceiling, trapped in his immobile body, and thoughts I could only guess at. "Good morning," I would say, forcing brightness into my voice regardless of how I felt. Ready to start the day. The morning routine was precise and exhausting. First, I would check his catheter bag, empty it, and record the output in the medical log I kept. Then came the medication, a carefully timed regimen of pain management, muscle relaxants, blood pressure regulation, and bowel control drugs. I would crush pills that needed crushing, mix them with applesauce, and feed them to Thomas spoonful by spoonful. "The blue one makes me foggy," he would often complain. "It's to prevent muscle spasms," I would remind him, as I had countless times before. Next came personal hygiene. I would carefully clean his face, brush his teeth, and shave him every other day. Thomas had always been meticulous about his appearance, and this part of our routine seemed to give him back a small piece of dignity. I would talk through what I was doing, making sure to respect his personhood, even as I performed these intimate tasks. The most challenging part was always the diaper change and bathing. In the beginning, we had a hydraulic lift to transfer Thomas from the bed to a specialized shower chair, but over time I learned to manage these tasks with minimal equipment. My back and shoulders bore the consequences of this daily physical labor, chronic pain that I treated with over-the-counter medication and ignored as best I could. "You missed a spot," Thomas might say as I washed him, or "the water's too hot," or "you're rushing today." I never rushed. Every movement was careful, deliberate, and focused on his comfort and preventing complications. Bed sores could be deadly for someone in his condition. I rotated him every 2 hours throughout the day, meticulously checking his skin for signs of pressure damage, applying creams, and performing range of motion exercises on his limbs to prevent contractures. By 8 in the morning, I would have Thomas clean, dressed, and transferred to his wheelchair. I would prepare and feed him breakfast position, his wheelchair by the window, or television as he preferred, make sure the voice-activated remote control was working properly, and finally begin attending to the household tasks that had accumulated. Laundry was constant sheets, special pillowcases, clothes soiled, despite my best preventive efforts. The house had to be kept immaculately clean to prevent infections. Bills needed to be managed, insurance claims filed, and often contested medical supplies inventoried and reordered. When the children still lived at home, I would somehow fit in making their lunches, helping with homework, and attending school events, often leaving Thomas in the care of a neighbor or one of the few aides we could occasionally afford when his insurance approved temporary respite care. "I don't like that new aide," Thomas would invariably say upon my return. "She doesn't position my arm right," or "she talks to me like I'm a child." There was always something wrong, some reason why no one could care for him as well as I did. The afternoon brought more medications, another round of personal care, physical therapy exercises I had learned to administer myself when the insurance-covered sessions ran out. I would read to Thomas, help him with the specialized computer setup that allowed him to browse the internet or send emails using voice commands, or simply sit with him and listen to his frustrations. Dinner, more medications, evening care, and then the night routine would begin. I would carefully transfer Thomas back to bed, position him with specialized pillows to prevent pressure points, connect his catheter to the overnight drainage bag, and set up the breathing apparatus he sometimes needed when lying flat. "Don't forget to turn on the humidifier." He might remind me, though I never did. By 10 at night, Thomas would be settled, and I would collapse onto my cot, setting my alarm for 2 a.m. to wake and reposition him, then again at 5 to start the whole process over. This was my life day after day, year after year. I learned medical skills out of necessity: how to suction airways, recognize early signs of urinary tract infections, manage autonomic dysreflexia episodes that could be life-threatening if not addressed promptly. I became nurse physical therapist, respiratory therapist, and dietitian all in one. The toll on my own health was significant. I developed chronic insomnia, waking at the slightest sound from Thomas, even when it wasn't time to reposition him. My once strong back became a source of constant pain. I gained weight, then lost it dramatically during a particularly stressful period when Thomas contracted pneumonia again in our 10th year of this routine. More devastating than the physical toll was the isolation. Old friends gradually stopped calling. My nursing colleagues moved on in their careers, while mine remained frozen. Even my sister, once close, visited less frequently, uncomfortable with the medical reality of our home and Thomas's increasingly bitter attitude. "You should get out more," Jessica would tell me during her increasingly rare visits home from college. "Dad would be fine for a few hours with someone else." But Thomas resisted any suggestion of outside care. "No one knows my needs like Edwina," he would insist. "I don't trust anyone else." What went unspoken was how much I had given up. I missed my daughter's college graduation because Thomas developed a pressure sore 2 days before the ceremony and refused to be left with anyone else. I turned down an invitation to my nephew's wedding because Thomas said the travel would be too difficult. My mother died with me 600 miles away because Thomas had a respiratory infection that he insisted only I could manage properly. The financial strain was another constant pressure. Thomas's disability benefits and insurance covered the basics, but there were always unexpected expenses: a broken wheelchair component, a specialized mattress not covered by insurance medications that had to be paid out of pocket when our coverage changed. Our savings dwindled, and I began selling off possessions, my jewelry first, then our second car, eventually even the lake house property we had purchased as an investment before the accident. Through it all, I kept going because I believed it was the right thing to do. I had promised for better or worse. I still remembered the man Thomas had been: charismatic, loving, ambitious. Somewhere inside the angry, demanding person he had become, I believed that man still existed. And on rare occasions, I would catch glimpses of him in a moment of gratitude, a shared memory, or a brief smile at something one of our children said or did. But those moments grew increasingly rare as the years passed and Thomas's demands grew increasingly unreasonable. It wasn't enough that I managed his medical care flawlessly. He began to criticize the way I dressed, the tone of my voice, even the way I arranged items in the refrigerator. Nothing was ever quite right, and the goalposts for what constituted acceptable care shifted constantly. "You used to take pride in your appearance," he might say, eyeing my practical clothing and unstyled hair. "Now look at you." He either didn't understand or chose to ignore that I had no time for such things, that every minute of my day was dedicated to his care or the maintenance of our drastically reduced household. By year 15, both children had established their own lives far from home. Jessica married a kind man named David and settled in Chicago. Michael moved to Seattle for a tech job and visited only on major holidays. I couldn't blame them. Home had become a place of tension, medical procedures, and their father's unpredictable moods. "You've turned them against me," Thomas accused, after one particularly strained Christmas visit. "They can barely look at me." "They love you," I insisted. "They just don't know how to connect with you anymore." "Because you've made me an invalid in their eyes," he retorted. "You emphasize my limitations instead of helping me overcome them." It was the cruelest irony that I, who had given up everything to care for him, was somehow cast as the villain in his narrative. But I swallowed the hurt, as I had swallowed so much over the years, and continued doing what needed to be done. That was my life for 3 decades, a life of service-sacrifice and silent suffering, a life I had chosen out of love and commitment, never imagining that the person I was caring for might view me so differently than I viewed myself. In the 15th year after Thomas's accident, I began to notice subtle changes in our relationship. The shifts were almost imperceptible at first: a sharper tone when he asked for something, a dismissal of my suggestions for his care, increasingly frequent criticisms of everything from the temperature of his food to the way I arranged his pillows. "You're doing it wrong," became his default response, regardless of how meticulously I followed the care protocols we'd established over the years. One evening, after I had spent 40 minutes carefully bathing him, Thomas sighed heavily as I was drying his arms. If I had a different caregiver, I wouldn't have these dry patches on my elbows. I paused, looking down at his skin, which I moisturized twice daily. "Thomas, the dermatologist, said these patches are from your medication. Remember, a competent caregiver would have researched alternatives by now," he replied coldly. I felt as if I'd been slapped. I had in fact researched extensively, consulted with 3 different dermatologists, and tried 7 different moisturizing regimens. I had binders full of research on every aspect of his condition. But rather than defend myself, I simply continued my task in silence. These interactions became more frequent as time went on. Thomas seemed to find fault with everything I did, comparing me unfavorably to the occasional respite caregivers or the nurses during his rare hospital stays. "Nurse Stevens knows how to transfer me without jostling my catheter," he might say, or "that aide last week made better coffee than you've made in 20 years. The praise for others always came with an implicit criticism of me, and I found myself becoming anxious about every task, second-guessing actions I had performed thousands of times before. As Thomas grew more critical, our children grew more distant. Jessica's visits became shorter and more strained. During one visit, when Thomas was particularly difficult, demanding that I remake his lunch 3 times because the sandwich wasn't cut correctly, I found Jessica in the kitchen afterward, gripping the counter with white knuckles. "Mom, this isn't right," she said quietly. "The way he treats you, it's abusive. He's frustrated with his condition. I defended automatically. It's not personal. It is personal, she insisted. I've watched him for years. He only behaves this way with you because he knows you won't leave. I changed the subject, uncomfortable with the truth in her words. But after she left, I found myself reflecting on our conversation more than I wanted to admit. Michael was even more direct during his Christmas visit that year. He had arrived to find me exhausted after a week of Thomas's respiratory infection, during which I had barely slept, monitoring his breathing and suctioning his airways throughout the night. "You need help," Michael stated flatly after observing me for just one day. "Professional help. Full time." "We can't afford that," I said, the standard response I had given for years. "Then he needs to go into a care facility," Michael countered. "Dad's insurance would cover that. You're killing yourself for someone who doesn't even seem grateful." "He's your father," I reminded him sharply. "Yes, and you're my mother," Michael replied. "And I'm watching him destroy you while you smile and take it." After that visit, Michael's calls became less frequent. When he did call, he would ask to speak to me first, often, not asking to speak to his father at all. The distance between father and son grew wider, and Thomas blamed me for it. "You've poisoned him against me," he accused after one such call. "I've done nothing but encourage him to maintain a relationship with you," I replied, frustration finally breaking through my usual calm. "If you were a better mother, he would be a better son," Thomas retorted. I left the room before I could say something I would regret. That night alone in the bathroom, I cried for the first time in years. Not just for the broken relationship between Thomas and our son, but for all the broken pieces of our lives that I couldn't seem to fix, no matter how hard I tried. Frank's visits only exacerbated the tension. While he rarely helped with Thomas's actual care, he seemed to take pleasure in suggesting experimental treatments, criticizing my caregiving approach, and generally stirring up Thomas's dissatisfaction. "You know, there's a clinic in Switzerland," he might begin, despite knowing full well we couldn't afford international treatment. "They're doing amazing work with stem cells. Thomas could be walking again if you'd look beyond your limited resources." These visits inevitably left Thomas agitated and me doubting myself, wondering if I truly was limiting his recovery through some failure of imagination or effort on my part. As I entered my 60s, my own health began to deteriorate noticeably. Years of lifting, turning, and physical caregiving had taken their toll. I developed arthritis in my hands, making fine motor tasks like buttoning Thomas's shirts or managing his catheter increasingly painful. The chronic back pain I had endured for years worsened to the point where I needed prescription medication to function. "You're getting sloppy," Thomas commented one morning as I winced while helping him sit up. "Your hands are shaking." "I'm in pain," I admitted, something I rarely did. "We're all in pain, Edwina," he replied dismissively. "Some of us just don't complain about it." I swallowed the retort that rose to my lips. What would be the point? Instead, I finished my task and took an extra pain pill, knowing it would make me foggy, but unable to function without it. Sleep became increasingly elusive. Even when I wasn't required to turn Thomas or attend to his needs, my body seemed to have forgotten how to rest. I would lie on my cot, listening to his breathing, anticipating the next call for assistance, the next complaint, the next crisis. When I did sleep, it was shallow and fitful, punctuated by dreams of drowning or being buried alive. Dreams a therapist might have interpreted as symbolic of my waking reality had I ever had the time or money to see one. Jessica became more insistent about getting additional help. During one of her visits, she brought brochures for assisted living facilities and in-home care services. "Mom, look at these," she urged, spreading them on the kitchen table while Thomas was napping. "There are options, good ones, places where Dad would get professional care and you could still visit every day but actually sleep through the night." "Your father would never agree to that," I said quietly. "Does he have to?" she challenged. "You have power of attorney. You could make this decision." I stared at her, shocked. I could never send him away against his will. That would be a betrayal of everything I've promised him. And what about his betrayal of you? Jessica asked. His vows included cherishing and respecting you. When was the last time he did either? I had no answer. The truth was, I couldn't remember the last time Thomas had thanked me genuinely or spoken to me with the respect one adult owes another, let alone with the love a husband should show his wife. But the thought of forcing him into institutional care felt wrong, a violation of the commitment I had made, not just in our wedding vows, but every day since his accident. I was Thomas's wife, his caregiver, his advocate. Without those roles, who was I? What would remain of me after 30 years of defining myself by his needs? The question haunted me in the quiet moments between tasks, a growing whisper that I tried to silence with busy work and exhaustion. But it persisted, gaining volume as the criticisms increased, as my health declined, as the isolation deepened around me. Who was Edwina Williams, apart from being Thomas Williams' wife and caregiver? Did that person even exist anymore? And if she did, was there anything left of her worth salvaging? The day that changed everything began like any other. I woke at 5, performed Thomas's morning care, prepared his breakfast, and settled him in his wheelchair by the window, where he liked to watch the neighborhood come to life. He had been particularly demanding that morning, insisting that I redo his shave, because he felt I had missed a spot under his jaw, though my fingers could detect no stubble there. I'll be in the kitchen, I told him, placing the voice-activated remote within range. Call if you need anything. The eggs were undercooked, he replied, though he had eaten every bite. I simply nodded and went to start the laundry, my shoulders aching from the morning's exertions. It was nearly 11 when I heard the front door open, followed by Frank's voice calling out a greeting. I hadn't been expecting him. He rarely called before visiting, but I pasted on a pleasant expression and went to greet my brother-in-law. Frank, what a surprise. I would have prepared lunch if I'd known you were coming. Don't worry about it, Edwina, he replied dismissively. I just wanted to check on my brother. Why don't you go do whatever it is you do and we'll have some man-to-man time. I bristled at his tone, but was also grateful for the reprieve. I'll be in the kitchen preparing lunch. Thomas needs his medication at 12:30. Frank waved me off, already wheeling Thomas into the living room. I returned to the kitchen and began chopping vegetables for a salad, trying not to let Frank's dismissive attitude bother me. After all these years, I should have been used to it. I was reaching for a pot in the cabinet beside the living room when I heard my name. My hand froze mid-air as Frank's voice drifted clearly through the thin wall. Seriously, Tom, I don't know how you stand it. Edwina hovering over you, constantly treating you like an infant. I should have moved away, should have made noise to signal my presence, but something kept me rooted to the spot. What choice do I have? Thomas replied, his voice carrying the familiar note of complaint. She's just a free servant at this point, cheaper than hiring real help. My heart seemed to stop in my chest. Free servant. The words echoed in my mind, each repetition a fresh wound. Frank laughed. Well, you've got that right. But still, she's getting sloppy. I noticed your shirt wasn't buttoned properly, and there's dust on those shelves. You should demand better service. I do, Thomas replied, and I could hear the smirk in his voice. But she's so pathetically eager to please, I barely have to push. Just a few well-placed complaints and she's falling all over herself to do better. You always were the smart one, Frank chuckled. Get her to do for free what would cost a fortune otherwise. She doesn't have anywhere else to go anyway, Thomas continued. No career, no life outside of this house. Her self-esteem is too low to even consider leaving. Has she been giving you trouble about the money? Frank asked, his voice lowering slightly. No more than usual, Thomas replied. I've convinced her we need to keep a large cushion in the account for medical emergencies. She doesn't know I've been transferring some to my personal account each month. Good thinking, Frank approved. You earned that money. Why shouldn't you decide how it's spent? Their conversation continued, but I couldn't hear any more past the roaring in my ears. I clutched the counter for support, feeling as though the ground had dropped away beneath me. 30 years. 30 years of sacrifice of love, of believing I was caring for a man who, despite his bitterness and complaints, still valued what I did for him. 30 years reduced to free servant. Memories cascaded through my mind. Thomas's resistance to hiring additional help, even when insurance would cover it. His insistence that only I could meet his needs properly. The way he would praise outside caregivers to my face, but complain about them the moment they left. The separate account he had insisted we maintain for emergencies that never seemed to materialize. What else had I missed? What other manipulations had I accepted as love or necessity? I must have made a sound because the conversation in the living room suddenly stopped. "Edwina," Thomas called out, "is lunch ready yet?" I forced myself to respond, amazed that my voice could sound so normal when everything inside me was shattering. "Almost. 10 more minutes." I moved mechanically through the kitchen, my body on autopilot while my mind raced. I wanted to confront them, to storm into the living room and demand an explanation, but a deeper instinct held me back. I needed time to think, to process, to decide what this revelation meant for my future, because for the first time in 3 decades, I allowed myself to consider that I might have a future separate from Thomas's needs. I served lunch with a pleasantness that felt like a mask stretched over raw nerves. Frank ate heartily, complimenting the food in a way that now seemed patronizing rather than polite. Thomas nitpicked. As usual, the carrots were cut too large. The dressing had too much vinegar. "Sorry," I said, automatically, the word bitter on my tongue. How many times had I apologized for things that weren't my fault? How many thousands of sorries had I offered over the years for failing to meet impossible standards? After Frank left, I went through the motions of afternoon care. I gave Thomas his medications, performed his range of motion exercises, and adjusted his position in the wheelchair. My hands were gentle as always, but my mind was a battleground of competing emotions, hurt, rage, disbelief, and underneath it all, a growing sense of resolve. "You're quiet today," Thomas remarked as I prepared him for his afternoon nap. "Just tired," I replied, the understatement of my life. "You should take better care of yourself," he said, an echo of concern in his voice that I might once have found touching. Now I recognized it for what it was: self-interest disguised as care. After all, a free servant needed to remain functional. That night, after Thomas was asleep, I sat in the kitchen with a cup of tea gone cold and made a phone call I should have made years ago. "Jessica, it's Mom. I need your help." Jessica arrived 2 days later, having taken emergency leave from her job in Chicago. She found me sitting at the kitchen table, surrounded by financial documents, insurance policies, and legal papers I had unearthed from filing cabinets and desk drawers. "Mom, you look awful," she said, embracing me. "Have you slept at all?" "Not much," I admitted. "There's a lot to process." I had told her everything over the phone: the conversation I'd overheard, the financial discoveries I'd made afterward, the years of manipulation I was only now beginning to recognize. "I was right, Jessica," I said, pointing to bank statements spread across the table. "He's been moving money into a separate account for years. Small amounts that I wouldn't notice, but they add up to nearly $70,000. Jessica examined the statements, her expression hardening. "This is financial abuse, Mom. It's illegal." "I don't care about the legality right now," I replied. "I care about what it means. 30 years of caring for him, and this is how he sees me. This is what he thinks of me." "I've been trying to tell you," Jessica began. "I know," I interrupted. "You and Michael both tried to warn me. I wouldn't listen." "Because you're a good person," Jessica said gently. "You believed in your marriage vows. And your father didn't." I concluded, the truth of it settling over me like a weight. Jessica stayed with me in the kitchen as I called Michael, putting him on speakerphone to include him in our family discussion. Unlike his sister, Michael didn't seem surprised at all by my revelation. "I've known Dad was manipulating you for years, Mom," he said, his voice crackling through the connection. "I confronted him about it once when you were out getting his prescriptions. He told me to mind my own business, that marriage was complicated, and sometimes people needed management. His word, not mine. Why didn't you tell me? I asked, hurt that my son had kept this from me. Would you have believed me over Dad? Michael's question hung in the air unanswerable because we all knew the truth. I wouldn't have. I had been too invested in my narrative of sacrifice and duty to see the exploitation hiding beneath it. What do you want to do, Mom? Jessica asked, bringing us back to the present crisis. I don't know yet, I admitted, but I know I can't continue as before, not knowing what I know now. Over the next several hours, we developed a plan. Jessica would stay for a week to help me arrange for professional caregivers. Michael would fly in on the weekend to provide additional support and help me consult with a lawyer about the financial situation. What about Dad? Jessica asked. Will you confront him? Yes, I said, surprised by the steadiness in my voice. But not until everything else is in place. I need to be prepared for his reaction. The next morning, I called a home healthcare agency recommended by one of my former nursing colleagues. I scheduled an assessment for the following day, using funds from our joint account funds that I now knew Thomas had been secretly siphoning for years. I also contacted a lawyer specializing in elder law and financial abuse, setting up a consultation for when Michael would arrive. I wasn't sure what legal action, if any, I wanted to take, but I needed to understand my options. Through it all, I maintained my caregiving routine for Thomas. I bathed him, fed him, administered his medications, and listened to his complaints with a new awareness that changed everything. Each criticism, each demand, each dismissal of my efforts now revealed itself as part of a calculated pattern rather than the understandable frustration of a disabled man. Frank called the day after Jessica arrived, clearly surprised to find her answering Thomas's phone. Frank, what a pleasant surprise, Jessica said, her voice dripping with insincerity. No, Dad can't come to the phone right now. He's with the nurse from the home healthcare agency we've hired. Yes, full-time care. Mom's finally getting the help she deserves after 30 years. You should stop by next week when everything's settled. I'm sure Dad would love to explain the new arrangements to you. She hung up with a satisfied smile. He's furious, she reported. Good. The healthcare assessment went smoothly. The agency representative, a compassionate woman named Diane with 20 years of experience in spinal cord injury care, toured our home and reviewed Thomas's medical records. We can definitely provide the level of care Mr. Williams requires, she assured me. We have several caregivers specifically trained in quadriplegia management. When would you like to start? As soon as possible, I replied. Monday at the latest. Thomas, of course, objected strenuously when I informed him of the arrangements. I don't need strangers in my house, he insisted. You've always handled everything before. I'm 67 years old, Thomas, I replied calmly. I can't physically manage your care alone anymore. This is necessary for both of us. If you had kept yourself in better shape, he began. This isn't open for discussion, I interrupted, surprising both of us with my firmness. The agency starts Monday. You'll have professional care during the day, and I'll continue the evening and night routine until we see how things go. Thomas stared at me, clearly unused to this new assertive version of his wife. What's gotten into you lately? He demanded. Clarity, I replied, and left the room before he could respond. Michael arrived Friday evening, bringing with him a determined energy and practical support that complemented Jessica's emotional reinforcement. The three of us met with the lawyer on Saturday morning, while a temporary caregiver from the agency stayed with Thomas. Based on the documentation you've provided, Mrs. Williams, there's clear evidence of financial exploitation, the lawyer explained. You have several options, from formal legal action to simply separating your finances moving forward. I don't want to punish Thomas, I said, surprising myself with the realization that it was true. Despite everything, I didn't wish him ill. I just want control over my own life again. Then let's focus on that, the lawyer agreed. We can set up a new financial arrangement that protects your interests while ensuring Mr. Williams continues to receive appropriate care. By Sunday evening, we had a comprehensive plan in place. Professional caregivers would take over Thomas's daily physical care. I would move out of the master bedroom that had been converted for his needs and into the guest room upstairs. Our finances would be restructured to prevent further exploitation while maintaining Thomas's medical coverage. And I would begin reclaiming pieces of my own life, reconnecting with old friends, pursuing interests I had abandoned, and prioritizing my own health for the first time in decades. All that remained was to inform Thomas. We decided I would do this alone, though Jessica and Michael would be in the next room for support if needed. Monday morning arrived, and with it Diane from the healthcare agency, accompanied by Samuel the caregiver assigned to Thomas's case. I introduced them to Thomas, who was coldly polite, clearly still believing this was a temporary arrangement he could talk me out of. After showing Samuel the care routines and equipment, I asked for a private moment with my husband. Diane and Samuel discreetly withdrew to the kitchen, where Jessica and Michael waited. I took a deep breath, steadying myself for what needed to be said. Then I picked up one of Thomas's adult diapers from the bedside table, placed it gently in his hand that rested on the wheelchair's armrest, a hand that couldn't feel my touch but could support the small weight, and looked directly into his eyes. "I heard you talking to Frank last week," I said quietly. "I heard you call me your free servant." Thomas's face went through a rapid succession of expressions, surprise, guilt, then quickly settling into defensive anger. "You were eavesdropping on a private conversation." "I was getting a pot from the cabinet," I replied, remaining calm. "But yes, I heard everything. About how I'm your free servant, about how you've been manipulating me for years, about the money you've been secretly transferring." Thomas's eyes darted toward the door, perhaps hoping Frank would appear to back him up, or perhaps looking for escape from a conversation he never expected to have. Finding neither, he attempted another tactic. "You misunderstood," he said, his voice softening. "Frank and I were just joking around. You know how he gets always pushing me to be more assertive. I don't really think of you that way." "Don't lie to me, Thomas. Not anymore." I gestured to the diaper in his hand. "For 30 years, I've changed these for you. I've bathed you, fed you, turned you every 2 hours to prevent bed sores. I've advocated for you with doctors, managed your medications, and sacrificed my career, my health, and my relationships to care for you." "And I'm grateful," he began. "No, you're not," I interrupted. "If you were grateful, you wouldn't have been stealing money from our joint account. You wouldn't dismiss and criticize everything I do. You wouldn't deliberately try to separate me from our children." Thomas's face hardened. "So this is it. After 30 years, you're abandoning me because of one overheard conversation, what happened to in sickness and in health." "I honored those vows for 30 years, I said. "I stayed through the sickness. I stayed through your depression, your anger, your bitterness. I stayed when you pushed everyone else away. But vows go both ways, Thomas. You promised to love and cherish me, and somewhere along the way, you decided I was worth neither. So you're leaving, just like that." His voice cracked slightly, the first genuine emotion I'd seen from him in years. "No," I said. "I'm not leaving. But things are changing starting today." I explained the new arrangements, the professional caregivers, my move to the upstairs bedroom, the financial restructuring. With each detail, Thomas's expression grew darker. "You can't do this," he finally sputtered. "You can't just change everything without my consent." "I'm not asking for your consent, Thomas. I'm informing you of decisions I've already made." I leaned forward, my voice firm but not unkind. "For 30 years, you've had control over every aspect of our lives. That ends today. I'll refuse to cooperate with these caregivers," he threatened. "I'll make their lives hell until they quit." "You're welcome to try," I replied. "But unlike me, they're paid professionals who won't tolerate abuse. They'll provide excellent care regardless of your attitude, but they have no obligation to endure mistreatment." "And what will you be doing while these strangers take over?" he demanded. Living Thomas, something I haven't done in 3 decades. I stood up feeling taller somehow despite my physical exhaustion. I'll still be involved in your care decisions. I'll still manage your medical appointments. I'll still be your wife if that's what we both want moving forward. But I will no longer be your servant, free or otherwise. Thomas stared at me, seeming to truly see me for the first time in years. You've changed, he said finally, a note of uncertainty in his voice. No, I corrected him. I've remembered who I was before I subordinated everything to your needs. There's a difference. I called Jessica, Michael, Diane, and Samuel back into the room. Samuel will be taking over your morning care now, I told Thomas. I've shown him your routine, but feel free to let him know your preferences. Diane will check in regularly to make sure everything is going smoothly. Thomas refused to look at any of them, his jaw set in stubborn anger. I recognized the expression. It was the same one he'd worn in the early days after his accident when he was raging against the unfairness of his condition. He would try to outlast us all to wait until everyone gave up and things returned to his version of normal. But that wasn't going to happen this time. The first few weeks of the new arrangement were predictably difficult. Thomas refused to speak to me unless absolutely necessary. He complained constantly about Samuel and the other caregivers, insisting they didn't know what they were doing, though their professional competence was obvious. Frank showed up unannounced one afternoon, clearly sent by Thomas to intervene. He found me in the garden, the first hobby I had reclaimed for myself. What the hell do you think you're doing, Edwina? He demanded, standing over me as I knelt by my newly planted rose bushes. Gardening, I replied mildly, not looking up. You know what I mean. Thomas is devastated. After everything he's been through now, his own wife abandons him. I stood slowly, brushing dirt from my knees. Frank, I'm going to say this once, and then I want you to leave. I haven't abandoned Thomas. I've hired professional care for him and restructured our living arrangements to better serve both our needs. If you have a problem with that, take it up with the lawyer handling our case. I believe he's particularly interested in discussing the financial irregularities you encouraged your brother to engage in. Frank blanched. That's not what happened. Isn't it? I met his gaze steadily. I have 30 years of documentation, Frank. Every withdrawal, every transfer, every conversation where you undermine my care. So unless you want to explain all that to a judge, I suggest you support your brother in adjusting to his new circumstances. Now please leave my property. He left without another word, and his visits became much less frequent after that. As the months passed, a new rhythm established itself in our household. Samuel and the other caregivers proved exceptionally skilled, and despite Thomas's initial resistance, they won his grudging respect through their professionalism and consistency. I focused on rebuilding my health, starting with long overdue medical appointments for myself. My doctor was alarmed by the toll 3 decades of caregiving had taken on my body. Severe osteoarthritis, nutritional deficiencies, hypertension exacerbated by chronic stress. You need to prioritize your own health now, he advised, prescribing medications and physical therapy. Your body has been sending warning signals for years that you've been ignoring. With Jessica's encouragement, I joined a support group for long-term caregivers where I found understanding from others who had walked similar paths. For the first time, I spoke openly about the complex emotions I had suppressed for years, the resentment alongside the love, the anger alongside the commitment, the grief for the life I had lost alongside the pride in the care I had provided. You did an extraordinary thing, my therapist told me during one session. You gave 30 years of your life to someone else's needs, but continuing to destroy yourself wouldn't have served either of you. Slowly, I began to reconnect with old friends and make new ones. I started volunteering at the local library 2 mornings a week. I took a watercolor class at the community center. I had lunch with former nursing colleagues who welcomed me back into their circle with open arms and no judgment. 6 months into our new arrangement, I took my first trip away from home, a weekend visit to Jessica in Chicago. It was the first time I had been more than 20 minutes from Thomas in 30 years, and though I checked in with the caregivers multiple times a day, I also allowed myself to enjoy the freedom of walking along Lake Michigan, attending a concert with my daughter, and sleeping uninterrupted through the night. Thomas's adjustment was slower and more complicated. Without me as a constant presence to direct his frustrations toward, he was forced to confront his own role in our dysfunctional dynamic. The professional caregivers, while compassionate, maintained appropriate boundaries that Thomas couldn't manipulate or cross. A year after the change, Thomas developed a urinary tract infection that escalated to sepsis requiring hospitalization. I sat beside his hospital bed, not as his caregiver, but as his wife, advocating with medical staff and ensuring his needs were met. During one lucid moment between fever spikes, he looked at me with clearer eyes than I had seen in years. I didn't appreciate what I had. He said, his voice weak but sincere. I didn't appreciate you. No, I agreed gently. You didn't. I was angry for so long, he continued, at the world, at God, at myself. You were just there, the easiest target. I know, I said because I did. I had studied enough about trauma and chronic illness to understand the psychological impact. Understanding didn't excuse his behavior, but it helped explain it. Is it too late for us? He asked, vulnerability replacing his usual defensiveness. I considered the question carefully. I don't know, Thomas. We've both changed. I'm not the same woman who stood by your bed 30 years ago and promised everything would be all right. And you're not the same man I made that promise to. No, he agreed. We're not. But maybe, I continued, we can get to know who we are now. Start from here, not from what was or what should have been. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was an opening, a possibility. After his recovery, Thomas asked to speak with a therapist, something he had resisted for 3 decades. It was a small step, but a significant one. The anger didn't disappear overnight, nor did the habits of criticism and control. But he was trying, and for the first time in years, I saw glimpses of the man I had married, not just the bitter shell he had become. 2 years after I placed that diaper in Thomas's hand, our lives had found a new equilibrium. I had reclaimed my identity beyond caregiving, pursuing interests and relationships that nourished rather than depleted me. Thomas had adjusted to professional care and was working, however imperfectly, on becoming a person worth being around. Our marriage would never return to what it once was, but perhaps it could evolve into something more honest, more balanced, a relationship between 2 whole people rather than between caretaker and dependent. As I reflect now at 67, I realize that the greatest lesson of these past 30 years wasn't about sacrifice or duty. It was about the difference between loving someone and destroying yourself for them. It was about the courage to set boundaries, even with those who cannot care for themselves. It was about recognizing that martyrdom serves no one in the long run, not the martyr, and not the person they're sacrificing for. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself and for others is to say enough, to place the metaphorical diaper in their hand and reclaim your right to be more than someone else's servant. If my story resonates with you, I hope it gives you permission to examine your own caretaking relationships, to ask whether they're built on mutual respect or on exploitation. I hope it encourages you to value yourself as much as you value those you care for. And I hope it reminds you that it's never too late to rewrite the terms of your own life. Have you ever had to set difficult boundaries with someone you love? How did you find the courage to put yourself first, after years of putting others' needs before your own? Please share your experiences in the comments, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video if you found value in my story. Your support helps others find the strength to make their own difficult but necessary changes. Thank you for listening, and remember, caring for others starts with caring for yourself.